You're listening to What She Said, a podcast about blogging, creativity, and life online, hosted by me, Lucy Lucraft, a freelance journalist and blogger based in Brighton. Hi, Flora. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Very excited to speak to you.
Oh, nice. Thanks, me too.
So for anybody who doesn't know who you are, can you please introduce yourself and then just give us a bit of a brief rundown of your blogging journey to date?
Sure thing. So I'm Flora. I run a website called Flora the Explorer, which has been running since 2012. And I first started blogging solely about travel, and that was when I was backpacking in India and then in South America for a long time. And over the last few years, it's kind of switched somewhat more into kind of personal narrative, a lot to do with like grieving and mental health, because both my parents have now sadly passed away. My dad last year, so that's kind of taken over my site somewhat recently. But yeah, I tend to kind of write stories and narrative driven articles, really delving into kind of more what I'm thinking about a place rather than just the surface level stuff that the place offers.
I think that's probably what you're, in fact, not probably, that is what you're known for, is your very long form, what I consider to be, I have to be a bit careful to say this, proper travel writing. So, and I don't write like this either, but I'm not a proper travel writer, but I see your writing as the travel writing that made me want to be a travel writer.
Oh,
you know, it's
lovely.
Storytelling and narrative, and yeah, you do have practical tips in there as well, but I think you're often hailed as someone who doesn't write for SEO, which is a dubious accolade, because it's kind of incorrect in that you are writing, you're not writing under and asking Google not to show you. But yeah, I understand why people say that. You don't do listicles, and
I really don't. And I mean, to be honest, that's where blogging gets more difficult for me, because I think we both started a fair amount of time ago. And when I first started blogging, I remember meeting people, and there was just like other bloggers and stuff at conferences and things, and it was still such a new thing, and nobody was really concerned about SEO and traffic and analytics and all this. I mean, there wasn't analytics really to look at except for in WordPress. And I never really bothered thinking about that stuff. I remember writing articles from when I was in India, writing the most obscure titles for things because they made sense to me and I found them funny. So I remember writing about Pushkar once, and I'd literally called it, like, because we'd celebrated Holi the day before or the week before or something, and I'd written an article called like coloured powder and Gandhi's pocket watch, because I'd picked up this weird watch that looked like Gandhi's in a charity shop. And like that made sense to me, and it was really funny. And of course, thinking back now, like nobody will ever find that article. No one will know it's about India at all. And that's now a problem for me, because my traffic drops quite significantly because I write stories. I don't write how-to lists or like advice or whatever, which is a bit sad, because obviously I want traffic, but also the response I get from people who enjoy stories and enjoy like narrative that they get lost in, I mean, that kind of feedback is really great. It's just obviously slightly lesser now, I think.
Yeah, and you're human. We can all say, oh, we know they're not, it's vanity, it's a vanity metric and it doesn't matter. And we can all say numbers don't matter.
Yeah.
But actually, when you work in an industry where that is what is measured a lot of the time, it's only reasonable to feel a bit crappy when you know that you're putting as much, if not more, effort into your posts as anybody else, and you're physically not going to be able to get the same traffic. Even though I imagine your bounce rate and all of those other great metrics are going to be so much better, because people are going to stick around on your website a lot longer.
I mean, you say this, but I have zero idea how to check these things. I've never known.
Flora.
Going into the back end of websites and looking at these things, I have no idea. But no, what I do find interesting actually is like, and you have done a lot of this stuff and like talked about this online a lot, but like there's been quite a few times, particularly dealing with like a parent, like my dad was dying for about 8 months, and then the last year of like grieving has been really tough, and obviously it's really hard to like talk about positive, shiny, happy travel things on social media when you're going through something awful. And I tried my damnedest to just kind of stick into shiny, happy travel things on social media, and then realized that I just didn't want to do it, and couldn't be bothered. And I remember kind of watching my Instagram in a very separated way, just watching followers drop off because I wasn't posting. But it made me feel, at the risk of using a very cliched word, I felt much more authentic because the things I was writing were about how I was actually feeling. And I wasn't posting when I didn't feel like posting. And I think the stress of like, quantity over quality all the time on so many people's channels just gets really overwhelming. And I don't really believe it a lot of the time, because I think a lot of people are going through stuff and don't want to say that. So they just put a veneer over it instead. And I think people are getting wise to that now.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's something to be said for sharing whenever you feel comfortable to do so. I do understand. We've talked about this quite a lot on the podcast recently, that having that privilege of Instagram particularly not being your full-time job means that you can take a chunk of time out, or
Yeah.
like how we'll post about literally what we're feeling, and I'll be very honest in my captions. And that's because I'm not bankrolled by it. So
yeah, that's very true.
It is easier. But at the same time, I do think you get a better connection when you're honest and vulnerable, even if it feels a bit icky.
For me, it's less about the icky feeling and more about the like trying. I mean, people are always talking about, finding your audience and stuff. And I seem to have got a much smaller audience than I did when I started. And that's obviously a bit disconcerting. But then again, there's the people who've just commented every single time I write something for the last 6 years. And they're essentially like your core audience and the core people you're talking to. And what I have found recently, which is kind of overwhelming in a way, but also really humbling, is having written a few articles about grief. I've had a lot of messages from people saying that they didn't know where to go, and then found articles I've written and then got really in depth in a message about what they're going through with, losing somebody, or often like someone they're with has lost somebody and they don't know how to kind of get in and like find out if they're okay and stuff. And I don't know, it kind of feels a little like I'm transitioning from like just doing travel writing to kind of more mental health and grieving stuff, just because it's more pertinent to me at the moment. And it's kind of, we were saying before, like quite deep stuff, and I like talking like that. I find it hard to just talk superficially or write superficially.
Yeah, which makes total sense.
Yeah.
And also the place that you're in now. So you talked about grief a little bit before your dad died, because your mum died when you were quite young.
Mm-hmm.
So I do remember you talking a bit about it then, but then having to go through essentially nursing your dad and then him dying before you were 30, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's a really unusual situation to be in, and a really shit one as well.
It is shit. It's very shit. But shit. I think it has given me a huge amount of perspective on like how people deal with grieving, and I'm sure people who listen to your podcast have heard the Grief Cast, but just if they haven't, quick plug, because the Grief Cast is just the best podcast I've ever listened to, apart from yours.
I think it is better. You can say it's better. I think it's better.
It's phenomenal, and it's run by a woman called Carrie Lloyd, and she lost her dad when she was 15, and it's weird. Like, I'm pretty sure you can be so arrogant about your own emotions. Like, my mum died when I was 20. It's coming up to 10 years in January. It'll be 10 years since she died. And when I was 20, so yeah, a decade ago, like dealing with grief in a kind of, UK wide or even globally, like it wasn't talked about and it wasn't addressed at all. And like, I remember going to a therapist at my uni, because I was at uni at the time in my second year, and I had one meeting with the therapist who made me sob like crazy at like 3 PM when I wasn't feeling sad. She like promoted the like talking about sad stuff, and I just thought it was ridiculous, and so I stopped going. And then just kind of like shunned all concepts of therapy, because nobody told me it was something I should do, and nobody explained the benefit of it. And now people are so much more open to the idea of talking about mental health and talking about like being depressed, but also the ways that you might get to depression. And that's definitely what's happened to me. Like I never really addressed my mum's death when she died. And when my dad passed away, I kind of had like a double whammy, and like have basically spent the last year kind of dealing with both of their deaths instead. But it is really surprising when I get messages from people, if I just talk very briefly about a therapy session on Instagram stories, for instance, and then I'll get like 5, 6 messages from people saying, oh my God, you go to therapy. What kind of therapy? Like, how did you find someone? I don't really know how to look for a therapist, but I really like to. And it's just really amazing to me that it's getting more and more normal and common to like talk about not being okay in your head, which, yeah, I just think it's so important. And people are really, I'm really happy that people are finding it a bit easier to talk about.
But do you think, because I think it's interesting that when you post about something like that, that people will be like, oh my goodness, and then also ask you a lot of questions privately, because I think that actually signals how little normal, in quotation marks, people talk about going to therapy.
Actually, yeah, I think you're right. I think the fact that it's all quite private is, again, I'm kind of in a very skewed realm with it, because I remember I was in Bali a few weeks ago, and I changed my Instagram profile to saying like often talks about grief and mental health, just because I thought like I finally needed to put it somewhere, because currently like everything I have is just like I write about travel and like nothing about the stuff that I really do want to talk about a lot at the moment. But yeah, I think you're right. Like people are still very private about reaching out, but I guess the difference is I would never have reached out. I would never even thought about it when I was 20, and there was no like parameters for it. Like nobody had I didn't know anybody who'd been to therapy, for instance, and I didn't like, neither my dad, like none of my friends had parents who knew therapists. Like it wasn't a thing. And I think, yeah, maybe now just I'm more aware of it, so other people are more aware of it by proxy.
But I think that's a testament as well to how you're just an open book, and in a very accessible way talk about your mental health and grief, and you don't put a veneer on things, so that gives other people permission to, and makes them feel safe to come to you, because I'm sure there are lots of people who talk about it and maybe in a performative way, I don't know, not grief necessarily, but mental health. And that doesn't necessarily invite confidences in, I don't think.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because I have found myself following more and more people who, I mean, for my own resource as well, like people who've discussed like anxiety or depression. Like I get very anxious now, and I didn't used to, so that's been quite a big shift to kind of get around. But yeah, I guess it's sometimes a bit tricky, because people will just kind of say that they're going through something but not necessarily make that approachable. And it might also be because people are fighting their own battle, and that's really hard for them, so they're willing to mention it's going on but not willing to like be a source of help for other people necessarily.
Yeah, which I think, that's fair enough.
It's understandable. Oh my God, completely.
Yeah. You've got to protect yourself, especially when it comes to mental health. I wanted to ask you how you found, because I think when you've been, we both knew each other as straight up travel bloggers, but I started going through a bit of a transition away from travel blogging before you probably, and you're going through one now, not necessarily away from travel blogging, but away from, I am a travel blogger. That is what I'm in that box. How have you found it? Because for me, I found it really, really hard. Surprisingly hard to let go of, surprisingly hard and surprisingly emotional to let go of my travel blogging identity, even down to it's WTM at the moment, which for the uninitiated is World Travel Market, and I'm not going this year because I live in Brighton now, and it's in London, and I've gone for the past 5 years, which is a long time.
Yeah,
let me tell you. And
oh God, it is.
It's full on. But great, and all my a lot of my travel blogging friends are there, and there's lots of parties, and it's really good fun, as much as it is quite awful, because it's a big conference centre.
Very achy feet.
Very achy feet, and you get very bored of giving your elevator pitch.
Oh,
but I found it really hard. I had to mute stuff about WTM on Twitter.
Oh, love.
Yeah, I know, but isn't that sad? Like,
but the thing is, like, I could totally go to WTM, and I've thought about it, and I might go tomorrow. I'm not sure, but like, every single year I've gone, without fail, even if I've had meetings with brands and like people who don't know about WTM, like you'll make appointments with tourist boards and destination representatives and like chat about the potential of you going places. Like I remember I went to a meeting with someone from a Mexican like eco resort thing who were really keen to talk to me, and I had like a full half-hour like meeting with them, and it was all like yeah we're gonna do things, and then nothing transpired from it. Like I chased them and like nothing happened, and I've pretty much only ever gone to conferences to meet friends, really, like make friends and meet old friends. And I guess what maybe is slightly easier for like on my end for like transitioning away from just being a travel blogger is the like ace in the pack of my parents died. Like I don't really care what other people think.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
Which is difficult if you're switching to a niche that's something you're kind of testing the waters of, like, you know, doing ethically conscious stuff and being much more eco-friendly and all those kinds of things are like you were trialing your life going that way as well.
yeah,
I guess. Whereas for me, I've been like thrown this situation that I'm living anyway. And I guess on that end, it's a bit easier to just be like, well, screw everybody. I'm not talking about travel anymore. I'm just going to talk about mental health. But I
yeah.
think the nice thing is to be able to encompass traveling into that as well. And what I think I might try and do at some point is talk more about what you do go through when you travel, like mental health wise, because that's important. And people don't, I think a lot of people always just, I remember writing an article a long time ago about like being really scared about traveling solo but doing it anyway, and I had a few responses from bloggers who were just like, I just don't get scared when I'm by myself, I just don't get worried or like find it hard or get nervous. And I'm like, really? Like what? How is that possible? And I suddenly realized that maybe I'm just like different to them. I just assumed that everybody like had massive pangs of what if no one likes me, like, oh, this hostel's really busy and everyone looks cooler than me, like all this stuff. Turns out not everyone thinks like that.
Who knew? I didn't know. I presumed
No,
everybody felt like that.
exactly, I know. But that's my point. I think people who can kind of do straight up, like, look at me, I'm a big brash blogger, like in a great way, but that's the people you aspire to be like if you're like worried that you're a bit nervy. Whereas I'm on the other side of it, like I'm a bit nervy and I do it anyway. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think that is stuff that not enough people talk about, is the side of travel that it's amazing. It's amazing. It's so much fun. But I liken it to, this is the analogy I always use, and I wonder if you'll feel the same. So if someone says to me, what's your favourite country? I'd probably say India, because it's just, and then, or if they say, would you ever recommend going to India? What's it like? I'll immediately say, oh my God, it's amazing. You have to go. You'll love it. It's just magical and colourful, and the food is amazing. The people are amazing. But when I was in India, I did not feel like that. Do you know what I mean? I was like, I need to get out of this country. You're driving me mad. Everyone needs to stop touching me. And,
and stop staring.
Stop staring. I don't want a picture. Leave me alone.
Oh my God. See, it's extraordinary because, yeah, I usually say I can't pick one. I'll go for three. And I usually say India, Bolivia, and Iceland, just because they're like very different.
Very different.
They've got qualities. Yeah, they've all got qualities I love. What is, of course, extraordinary is that both in India and Bolivia, I had some of the worst mental times of my life, but not realizing that I was like having mental difficulties. Like I remember being like so depressed in Bolivia, traveling by myself. And I remember being in a hotel because I was trying to learn Spanish and was doing like one-on-one classes. So I'd opted not to stay in a hostel. So I'd like actively put myself in a non-sociable environment. And then I was just in a hotel room, like a skeezy hotel room. And I heard a couple like having sex in the room next door and was like, oh my God, I feel so alone. Oh my God. And I was so depressed. And I remember having a massive, like, what the hell are you doing with your life, Flora? Like, why are you still in South America bumming around? Why aren't you in London working a job? Like, all this stuff. And got really, really upset and angry with myself. And yet I'm still like, Bolivia's great. I love Bolivia. It's so cool. It's extraordinary. It really is. We're very good at rose tinted stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I think never more than when you're traveling somewhere really, really intense, and also for an intense amount of time, because when you're traveling long term, backpacking for a big chunk of time, it's the highs are so much higher and the lows are so much lower, because you have you do it kind of equal parts fast, and have way more downtime and kind of boring. So, some of the train journeys that I did in India were like two days long. And when anybody asks me about trains, I'm like, oh my God, they're amazing. But I remember clearly, so clearly, having a poo on a train in the squat toilet and, just seeing it drop down on the tracks. That is a low moment. And cockroaches kind of around my feet. That
my God,
a low moment.
And it's so strange as well, because when you're like in hostels and stuff, when you're traveling and you kind of you swap war stories of like, oh God, I had this awful train journey and someone else is like, I can trump that. Like I had an even worse like plane ride through this part of the world. And you always do like the really negative stuff. But then when you're like, I guess maybe it's the curse of being a blogger is that, the automatic is to be much more positive about things.
Yeah, I think
that's also something else that really pisses me off about blogging now, is that like when I first started doing it, there was no kind of category that you had to fit into. It was never like, you go to Cuba for 6 days and you're like, I've written the most like in-depth exclusive guide to the entire island and you'll learn everything from me. Like that was never a thing that we did. It was just like you wrote about where you were and that was all.
Do you think that you've got rose-tinted glasses though about it? Because I remember when I started travel blogging, which is 2013, so not too long after you, going to a T-Bex, and people were very much starting travel blogs to make money. Already. They were they were already talking about SEO and analytics and all of those sorts of things. And people were already carving out those niches, those kind of inauthentic niches where they do exactly what you're saying. Go somewhere on a press trip for 2 days, stay somewhere that nobody else would be able to afford to stay, and then they're the expert on the area.
Oh, it grinds me so much. But actually, yes, that's a wonderful realization that yes, I'm definitely rose tinting both countries that I hated and also blogging when I started, because I think also I just very much put my head in the sand for a very long time, which is why I still make like no money from my website, because I was always really pious and I'm like, I'm not going to have advertising, and then realized that I don't know how to do affiliate and I don't work with enough people to like actually make money. So it's it's a bit of a sticky one. And also the fact that my writing is definitely not SEO driven. So again, like I just went to Bali and like all the things I want to write about Bali are just like stories. And then in the back of my head, I'm like, I need to write, 8 unique things to do in Bali, don't I? Because that's how you're gonna get people to read. But they're not things that come naturally to me. Like whenever I've tried to like do copywriting as a job, I find it really hard because I'm being such a tortured artist. But I don't really find it very easy to write things that are really formulaic. Like I tend to just want to write about myself in situations. God, that sounds awful.
No, not at all. No, because I think I'm the same as you. I started a travel blog because I wanted to write about my travels and my life. I didn't want to, if I'm honest, and I'm sure I've said this on the podcast before, I'm not one of those people that can say, I write about travel because I want to help you to travel. Honestly, I don't really care how you travel. If I help you, then that's great, but that is the byproduct of why I'm writing. Now it's different. The stuff that I'm writing about is different because I'm doing it way more as a resource and to help people. But still, ultimately, there are posts where I'm just writing for the joy of writing. I think that's okay.
I think that's perfectly okay. And I think that's probably the major thing that has made it difficult for us, maybe travel blogging, but probably, clearly way more successful for you the way you're doing it now. And I'd like to think the same thing would happen to me eventually, because you're clearly passionate about the stuff that you're talking about, that you want to help people with. And same with me writing about grief stuff. Like when I get messages in my inbox from like someone who's lost both their parents and doesn't know how to grieve, and they're like finding it really hard, they're being really hard on themselves, and like, their mum died 4 years ago, so they should be fine by now. And I'm like, oh my God, my mum died 10 years ago and I'm still crying like all the time. Like, it's fine. It's fine. It's your own process. And that I really want to help with. Whereas someone says to me, I've got 2 months to travel, where should I go? I'm just like, oh, for God's sake, like, why are you asking me? Exactly. Moreover, like, ask someone who's like made a platform about doing that, about giving that help, because you're right. Like, I don't have that as my modus operandi. Like, that's not what I'm writing stories for. I'm writing stories because I'm working on how I tell stories, like very selfishly. It's my own like way of practicing. And also I just think that, probably slightly arrogantly, that there aren't that many people who write travel stories rather than just travel blogging, and I kind of like that people enjoy it, and I want that to be a common thing. I'd like it that more people did that, and when I find bloggers doing that, I get really excited.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, because I
Really...
don't also read travel blogs really,
No,
apart
God, no
from
one does anymore.
yours, Lauren's. There's a couple, but basically my friends whose writing I like, and it
Yeah,
tends not to be because I look at their website and go, oh yeah, I really want to go here. I'm going to search for a helpful. I'll go to different people for that, but I probably won't read their posts regularly,
yeah.
if that makes sense.
And also, yeah, it does. And also, I've realized that I am a complete hypocrite, because the amount of times I like bash people for writing these top 10 lists and like guides and stuff, that's all I Google for.
Well, yeah,
Like,
exactly.
you
Yeah.
know, I'm not gonna Google like for things for Bali and look for stories, because I'm like, I want to work out where to go, and I want to work out what to do. And yeah, you're right. Like, I don't really read many blogs anymore. I read the people I'm friends with because I like their writing, and there's a small subset of people who I think write like really good long form, like deep, kind of meaty like stories about what they're doing and where they are and stuff. And I think it's relatively rare now.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think that's fine. That's just the way the industry has gone. And
Yeah, no, it's
but
completely...
still, Google does reward. The algorithm does reward you for, or reward your website for the length of time people stay on it, and
Yeah.
the authority within writing. So even if you're not writing those listicle style posts, but I think to your point, yes, you're still getting the SEO benefit, but not as quickly as if you bashed out a whole heap of super practical, short, 600-word kind of guides.
Yeah. And to be fair, like whenever I do write those, they bomb. Like, nobody
Yeah,
reads them
I
because
can't
no one
imagine
goes
your
to my site to
people.
read them.
Yeah. I can understand that. So I actually wanted to ask you some
Hmm.
really practical tips to help people who are grieving, and that's a little bit different because we normally just talk about blogging.
Yeah.
But I think that, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like I've just got a superpower since. So it's my 10-year
I've read that
anniversary.
article of yours.
Yeah, the 10-year
Yeah.
anniversary of my dad dying next year as well.
Oh well. We should go and have
Should
a
we
grieving
celebrate?
dinner. That'd be good. Yeah, we should. We should.
The
Yeah,
Dead Parents Club.
yeah. It's an important club to be part of. It's very weird.
It's
I think I know
elite.
what you're going to ask, but I'll let you ask it and then I'll jump into what I was going to say, because it's a, yeah.
You wrote a really good post about this. So in terms of the superpower, I feel like the main one is that I feel very comfortable talking to other people about their grief. I do not feel scared of it, and I feel like I not necessarily know the right things to say, but I know that there is no right thing to say.
Hmm.
I know not to send flowers. I know that sometimes maybe someone just wants you to send them dinner or take them out for a drink or whatever. What kind of practical tips do you have? Because you wrote a really good post about this and it was really meaty. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm actually scrolling through it now just to see what I had written, but like, I think what I find really difficult about looking all this stuff up online is that you end up, and I get why, like there are tropes for a reason, but I find that a lot of advice on dealing with grief is like really trite. Like exactly what you said. It's like, send them flowers. And you're like, think about that for a second and deal with the fact that someone's going to have to find a vase, water them, deal with the fact when they're dying, put them in the bin. Like, they're going to go moldy. They always do. And it's really, really horrible to walk into your kitchen after crying for 3 days and find a moldy bunch of flowers on your like table. It's not fun. Like, I think for people who are actually grieving themselves, I think some of the things that have helped me hugely are writing down how I'm feeling, because I mean, I am, writing is my passion, so it makes sense. But a lot of the time I've noticed, particularly the last year, my grieving has kind of been quite ritualistic. Like, I've had like kind of 3 days of being really upset, or like feeling upset, and then a couple of days of like solid crying. And then it's shifted and it's gone into a kind of cathartic period, and I've been okay again for a while. And if I write those feelings down and like say what day it is and stuff, it kind of makes more sense. And I know that I felt better before, so I'll feel better again in a week or so and stuff, which is really helpful. And I think it's difficult for people to talk about it. I get that. But finding someone that you can speak to is so valuable. Like having someone just hear you out. And one of the major things is like not just talking about grieving, but like talking about them.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that's really only been made obvious to me in the last year or so is like getting really angry when someone thinks that they're going to be having to hear me talk about grief and kind of cut me off. And I'm like, no, I just want to talk about the fact that like my dad used to say this really funny thing and it's just come back to me. Or like, you know, I've just seen something that mum would have loved and I want to talk about it and explain why she would have loved it. Like keeping them alive is in your head, and like keeping the things that the idiosyncrasies alive is so important. Because I mean, it very much depends on how you lost someone. But like with my mum, it was such a shock. It happened, you know, she went from being a bit ill to suddenly being terminal and dying within like 2 weeks. And that's just, it's a sucker punch and you don't understand what's happened. And you're like, physically, your body doesn't understand what's happened. And to not have any kind of way to bring them into the daylight, as it were, is really, really difficult. So if you get to talk about them a lot, I find that really, really helpful.
I think it can feel really dismissive sometimes, and I know that's not how people mean it to come across, but it can feel really dismissive when you're told, when you're sort of cut off in a pseudo comforting way, because it is really nice to talk about people that you've lost. People, I don't even like using that
phrase. No, neither.
Yeah, people that you've lost. I didn't lose my dad. I knew where he was.
No, I knew very much where he was. Yeah, I know.
But yeah, no, I love talking about my dad and I love having the opportunity to do so. So when I remember my husband felt really uncomfortable with it for the first few years that we were together. And eventually I had to sit him down and be like, please, can I talk about my dad? Because I promise I'm not going to burst into tears. Don't worry.
But there's such a kind of complicated, like, internal process for them, I think, of oh god, like if I talk about the person who's died, like are they going to be upset about it? Am I going to say something wrong and they're not going to tell me and they're going to cry? Like, should I just shut the entire thing down and that's going to be better overall? And you're like, no, you need to understand in a very like calm way. You need to understand that I know what my triggers are, and I'm learning what my triggers are anyway. And if it gets too much, you'll know. Like I will start bawling, or I'll tell you to fuck off, or whatever. And like it'll be fine. Like we'll work it out. But like if I'm saying I want to speak about them, let me speak about them, because it's not talking about how much you miss them necessarily. It's talking about positive things, and you need them to. It feels really comfortable for me. I feel like I'm kind of settling into like a really nice little memory bubble. Yeah. To kind of talk about them. And like my parents used to. Like we had a lot of kind of familial language. They were both well, my mum was an actress, my dad was a director. So many like quotes and things to do with language. And I talk a lot anyway. So like there's a lot of things that I'll kind of suddenly remember, like little phrases they said and things. And I want them to stay in my vocabulary. And I tell my friends them and I'm like, mum used to say this, like, can we keep saying it? Because I want it to kind of stay part of my life, it's part of my daily life. And yeah, I don't know if people have that for themselves, but like for me, that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I think that's so lovely. There's just giving people the space and permission to just talk about the little what seems like little things probably to other people, but yeah, it's so wonderful to be able to keep the memories alive, because like we're both 10 years on. In one sense, but you're very fresh in another sense. And like you said, grieving, it's so complicated. I didn't deal with it for a really, really long time. And I still don't think I have. I don't know if I ever will. But it becomes really, really fresh again when things happen, even happy things. Like when I got married, it became really raw and fresh. And then when I had a baby, really raw and fresh. And then, of course, when my mum dies, it will be a whole new grieving process. Mm-hmm. So,
and it's really tough. But there was timely actually, Nick Cave lost his son, his 15-year-old son. Oh my God. I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but he fell off a cliff in somewhere and it was awful. But someone wrote a letter to him, or like wrote a question on his website, and he published the response recently, and it was so beautiful. It was doing the rounds on Twitter the other day, and just the quote that really hit me was like, to grieve is to love, or to love is to grieve, like one of the two. I'm going to see if I can find it. and it was just so beautiful. It's like that's the offset of loving somebody, is that
Mm.
you're going to have to grieve them, but it means that the two things are kind of undeniable. Like you're grieving because you loved someone, and I
Yeah.
think like having that love being kept alive is a really important thing. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Like grieving is awful, don't get me wrong, it absolutely sucks, and it has the ability to really, really mess you up. But I don't know if I would have, I don't know, like I feel like it's an incredibly self-educating process, put it that
Mm.
way. Like I know so much more about myself than I did like a year ago because of what I've been going through, and because I've kind of not stopped it from happening. Like with my
Yeah.
mom, I closed myself off from grieving a lot, and I was at uni and I just drank a lot and like smoked a lot. And then I went to San Francisco because I had my third year was in America because I was doing American studies, American literature. Um, so I went to America for a year, and there was no memory of her there at all. Like she'd never been, I'd never been before. So I didn't kind of see her anywhere. And that was really kind of therapeutic for me. So I just thought, oh, traveling, that's my big solve. Perfect. And that's also why I then kept traveling for like
Mm.
6 years pretty much, because I just thought that eventually grieving would kind of solve itself by proxy. And if I kept moving, like it would just end up happening. And it's only been the last few years that I've kind of been like, oh, you have to kind of let this happen. You can't kind of escape it. Like it's so many emotions that need to come to the fore and they need to be experienced and expressed and stuff. But it's really scary to do that. Like it's really, really scary. And I don't think that you can tell yourself you have to grieve. Like it's
Yeah.
just how it happens. Um, and thanks to my dad dying, it's just kind of had to happen now, and I've had to kind of go through it with both of them, and losing like my family because I don't have any siblings, so
Yeah.
they effectively have lost a family as well as both my parents, and that's a big thing to kind of combat.
Yeah, because on top of everything else, you've got the very practical, mundane minutiae of death admin to deal with
Oh,
alone. I mean, I know you're not
it's
alone, but I mean, in a very kind of just in a literal sense of both your parents not being there, and however old you are, you kind of default to your parents, don't you?
very much. But I remember I went to a like a travel, what was it, like not a travel conference, like a show, one of the things at Excel. And it was really sweet. I met this girl who followed me on Snapchat of all things, and had no idea I had anything else. That was what's so funny. She was like, she was like, "Are you Flora the Explorer from Snapchat?" I was like, "Yeah." And she was like, "You don't post on Snapchat anymore. Where else do you do things?" And I had to like tell her my Instagram and my blog and stuff. It's really funny. She was really sweet, but she was there with her mum, and her mum had like been told in very speedy time like who I was because we only met that minute. And her mum just said the most beautiful thing to me, and I kind of never really been able to forget it, because she said like one of the most amazing things your parents can do for you, like one of the last things your parents can do for you, is to let you take control of your own life, because while they're still alive, ultimately you always defer to them.
Mm.
And there's been so many occasions that I've been so pissed off that both my parents have gone, because I'm like, Dad, why didn't you tell me how to use the blooming boiler? Like,
Mm.
why don't I know how to reset the oven timer? Like all these things. But it's stuff that I just have to learn now. And ultimately it's kind of making, I hate saying I'm strong, or like people who are grieving are strong, because you don't get a choice in it. But it's undeniable that I have had to get stronger because of losing them.
Yeah.
And that's, again, not necessarily a bad thing. Like it's really horrible. I don't feel like it's the right time to have had that happen, but equally, like it is a really, self-creating thing. Like you do have to then become the person you're going to be, fanfares, all that.
I'll add them in.
Great, good audio tricks. But yeah, like I think that's really important as well. I think there's so much negativity with grief, but there are hidden positives. There are hidden, not positives, but there's hidden silver linings, put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, because
Yeah.
it's that really weird position where you're like, I would love my parents to be back, but
Hmm.
also I wouldn't be in this situation, which is great,
Mm.
with whatever whatever that might be, like a personality trait, or learning how to use the boiler or whatever, if they were still alive, which I'm sure there's not a very good trade-off, but you know what I'm saying.
Living parents or a working boiler, one of the two.
Oh,
but
tricky.
No, but it's true though. Like, I don't know what I don't know what my life would have looked like if I hadn't lost my mum 10 years ago. Like, I don't know what I might not have been traveling to the same extent. I might not have fallen in love with writing. It might not have happened. Like, and there's also just a huge amount of, I know the way I write now is because I've had a huge amount of loss.
Yeah.
Like, I know that people find my writing empathetic because there's emotion in there, because I don't want to not put emotion in there, because I feel a lot of emotion. And I don't know if that would have happened the same way. And I luckily had 20 years of, my mum was obsessed with me. Like, she was such a loving mum. And I met a friend of hers recently, and she was like, I think she just poured all the love she possibly could into 20 years because, not like she knew she wasn't going to last for longer than that, but it's a huge amount of kind of positive backlog to have behind you, to have had a really great family, even if they're no longer here.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, that is amazing. What were your parents' names?
Sue and John.
Oh, well, thank you, Sue and John, for sponsoring this episode of What She Said. It was wonderful to have you here in spirit.
They'd have loved it.
Thank you so much for being part of the podcast. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people who want to get in touch with you now for various reasons, read your beautiful writing and chat to you about grief. Where can they find you?
So my website is floratheexplorer.com, and I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Flora Baker.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And you can find me at Lucy Lucraft everywhere, but I mostly hang out on Instagram. You can find old episodes of What She Said over at lucylucraft.com, where you'll also find me chatting about all things blogging, travel, vegan life, and zero waste living too. Lastly, I know everybody asks this and it's a total pain in the ass, but please think about leaving the show a rating and review. It makes a huge difference to getting the show out to new listeners, and for every review you leave, I'll donate £2 to charity. So that's £1 for you and £1 from me. The chosen charity changes each month, so listen out for it in the intro each week. Thanks for listening.